Hello and welcome. Season 6, episode 13 of Dualistic Unity. I am not a musician. Never really saw myself as that. Never really felt like I was relaxed enough, quite frankly, to dig in to something as free flowing as that. But there's a part of me that kind of wants to get back in to that world a little bit. Have a guitar, spent a couple years doing that, but it was always never really learned the basics. Always just wanted to learn YouTube songs and jump ahead of all that. Kind of the shell of a experience without so much foundation. So, needless to say, I'm very excited for this conversation.
I also share your lack of musical ability. As much as I appreciate music and I appreciate karaoke, the fact is that I've never had the time or the exposure to the language of music, and so instead, I've learned to think of life as a kind of music. I may not know the difference between a C and an E note, but I can hear the difference between authenticity and fear. I can hear the difference between empathy and judgment. I can hear where we're coming from. And it very much is like a song when you allow yourself to just sink into it and listen rather than just looking for how it works mechanically and aligning with it so that way you can appreciate it. And that said, I'm very excited for this conversation. Today, we are joined by Trish Horrocks, and she is a violin and otherwise, I think, music teacher of various different instruments here in Nanaimo, where I live. She's actually my daughter's violin teacher, and she is the head of Fiddelium, which won two CBC Music Class Challenges over 2020 and 2021, and then the Canadian Folk Music Award in 2023 under the Young Performers of the Year category, and they are up for the same in 2024. Trish, you started folk band and Fiddelium in 2011, I believe, or did folk band come first? I guess we're just going to get straight into it. Trish, thanks for coming to the show. Feel free to tell us a little bit about what you do.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited. We'll eventually come around to dishing some dirt on your daughter's violin lessons. But yeah, I'm really bad at anything to do with numbers. I'm living proof that music does not make you better at math. I have no affinity for numbers. So every time somebody asks me, when did these programs start, I don't actually know, because it was just this sort of organic thing. So I have to go back to, like, how old were my kids when I started? I would say that folk band would have started in about 2005. And folk band is like a totally community based, all ages, all abilities, all skill levels acoustic group, but mostly fiddles who play in there. And then what happened was, at about the 2010 mark, 2011, we had this group of young teens that were kind of hotshots, and they came to us and said, we're bored. Folk band is not really very challenging, and we want to play some harder tunes. And I was teaching all of those kids at that time private lessons, so I knew their abilities, and I knew them well as people. And I said, okay, well, look, if you want me to invest time in creating the material for a brand new group, because I have to write the music for it, then I need you to make a commitment as well. And that is how Fiddelium was born. So a folk band, totally laid back, chill. We're all just there having fun. Do what you can. If you can't play all the notes, that's fine. Just show up for the notes you can play. Fiddelium is like the total other end of the spectrum, where it's precision, and I'm pretty strict about musical details and all those things. I think I freak the kids out fairly often. But it all arose out of first of all, a request from some young musicians, number one, and number two, my own personal belief that we collectively set the bar a little bit too low for our young people. And I think that we can show kids that they can achieve anything that they want to achieve in any part of their life, but that sometimes that takes work. And so that's kind of my passion with Fiddelium. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's where it all started.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really cool. And so I'm curious then, with the, transition from folk band to Fiddelium, and kind of how it's all encompassing of like the entire spectrum. Because just from what I've heard with Fiddelium, and I've seen some of the concerts that Ray's daughter has been a part of, it seems like there's a lot of fun. That's like, it sounds like they're having fun. It sounds like it's relaxed. And so I'm super curious with something that is very meticulous and maybe a little bit more serious, how you strike that balance between, taking things very seriously and having performances and whatnot and kind of wanting to be on the ball at all times and maintaining maybe a lightness, a sense of relaxation, and being able to have fun as well. How you balance those priorities between the spectrum there.
Okay. So I think to answer that, I have to kind of tell you a bit about my background as a young musician. I was a classically trained violinist, and I am still a lover of classical music. I absolutely, it makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I listen to this music. It's amazing. But the fact is that classical music and the way that we train classical musicians is all wrapped up in ego. It's all wrapped up in competition. It's all wrapped up in measure of your own personal greatness according to your musical skills as compared to somebody else's musical skills. And so the effect that that had on me, I grew up in Courtenay, which is a pretty small town, but at the time that I was coming through elementary school, there was a Suzuki program. Suzuki is like a by ear method of teaching violin. So none of us were reading music. And we had this massive program. So that little tiny Courtenay sent like 10 kids to the UVic Faculty of Music, which is like half the faculty that year. It was really quite an amazing program. So I arrived at UVic coming from this cute little small town, wonderfully inspired program, and was totally set on my ass because all those kids who came there from Vancouver and Victoria, who had been embedded in this canon of greatness and this whole ego thing and competition, I didn't measure up. I couldn't read music. I didn't have the skills on my instrument that they did. And so the net result was I did 2 years in music studies, violin performance. And by the time I pulled out of the program, I was so crushed musically and creatively. The violin went in the closet and it didn't get looked at or touched for 7 years. I didn't touch it for 7 years. I had just like, I was so completely tied up with anxiety and kind of like just self-loathing, actually, that I was so disappointed in myself that I didn't measure up. So that I changed majors, totally had another life. And all that time, it was sort of gnawing in the back of my heart that I do think I'm somebody who's wired to have a life in music. And I denied myself that because of this whole culture of ego. So 7 years later, I pulled the fiddle out and hadn't touched it, and I can still actually play, and found a teacher and got back into it. Ended up going back and finishing my undergrad and starting graduate school. And to this day, I am paralyzed with stage fright, utterly paralyzed. I cannot perform. My husband would love nothing more than for us to get on stage and make music together, and it's not possible for me. And I think it's because of that whole training, right? So move forward to Fiddelium. My goal with Fiddelium is to have kids achieve like really greatness, because we can all do this. We can all be great. But under no circumstances is there any culture of greatness in Fiddelium. I don't single anybody out as the superstar. I don't give anybody harder music than somebody else because they're better than somebody else. If there's any talk about that sort of comparison side of things, I shut it right down. Like, we really have been very careful to foster excellence and not foster comparison and ego. That's that, because that's music's supposed to be a spiritual practice, and how can it be if all we do is compare ourselves to somebody else? So that's, I think that's where the fun comes from. The kids are making music together. They're a community, and they communicate spiritually with each other when they play music. And because there's no culture of ego and greatness in Fiddelium, they're actually, they are having fun because they're vibrating together. That's all it is.
And it's fantastic to watch. I love the tone of trust and respect that goes with the group as a whole. And I think it's because you do so much to try and facilitate, I guess, connection. You will actually put certain members not in charge, but you'll give them roles of responsibility where they have to work with the other members. And that gives them a way to come together and actually form a relationship that's not just based on a hierarchy, where it's like, you're doing this because I'm above you and I say so. It's like, but we're all in this together, and it's kind of a collective brainstorming. I love how you integrate all of the enthusiasm and the creativity of your students, I think that that's why when you see them play, you can actually feel the enthusiasm. You can feel how much enjoyment they're having. And when one of them starts to dip a little bit or starts to fall into doubt, because you can see it on their expression, immediately they look at each other. And this is something that's often in a lot of your performances, is that all of a sudden the two players will look at each other and make eye contact for a sizable amount of time, and then turn around to another person and do the same thing. And you do this repeatedly. And I love the fact that every time you can feel the collective energy just buoy itself back up. It's like they make contact and like, you're not in this alone. And then they move on and they move the next person up as well. So I find that that is so very telling, I think, of your intention here. And I think it's very much because of that experience, because you recognize how much it sucks to think about getting up in front of somebody and to suddenly think of yourself as something that can have a measurable value by doing so, to live somewhere within that scale that you can be judged. It sucks. And so to remove that at such a young age, that's amazing.
You know, trust is the word that really jumped out at me there. I think that that's maybe the biggest thing that can get in the way. You know, music is, because of the way that we historically have presented music education in schools and talked about, you know, all the, I call them, when I'm talking to my students, the dead white guys: Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, you know, like the canon of greatness, right? Like there's a reason that we respect them as musicians and composers, but what about all the non-white composers? What about the women? What about the people who are writing music in their basement who didn't sell 1 million copies, who still make wonderful art? You know, that trust can't be there if there's judgment happening. But we're trained to judge. We're trained to value somebody's talent, and I do believe that talent is a thing, but I don't think talent is a requirement to be a creative person. I think that you can learn to create something. I'm taking pottery lessons right now. I am not talented, but I can make you a cup. But I am not talented. I have to work really, really hard at it, but I still get satisfaction, even though I'm not talented. So it's not about talent. I think trust you have to have each other's back, as both as a creator of any art form, but also as a consumer of the art form. As a consumer, as an audience member, you have to emit trust as well. You have to let the artist feel trusted in every part of the process.
Well said. And that talent is all relative too, right? Like where that bar is completely arbitrary. And it's interesting because I've been finding just more and more in my life recently that I've kind of tried to be things throughout my life, tried to look to other people, look to society, look for the right way to act, the right way to live, the right way to be. And I think whether it was, you know, music when I was younger, whether it was sports, it was always looking somewhere else. And as long as I looked somewhere else, there was a bar to be had. There was some way to judge myself, and it wasn't just trusting in myself. And so I've found that the more I've been willing to not look around so much, the more trust I've been able to build in myself, to continue to just, you know, get into things, jump into things. And so even with music especially, we'll look back at certain people, you know, the dead white guys, and try and emulate them in a sense. But there's a lot of rigidity in that, in an attempt to, you know, turn yourself into something else. And so with any sort of performance, I think there's such a difference when it isn't trying to be, like when you're not trying to be something so much, and there isn't that bar, because there isn't then that tension and sort of friction between just what's happening and the arbitrary judgments I'm making about myself as it's going on. And so to see you guys be able to sort of foster that environment for, you know, a lot of teenagers is, I mean, I can only imagine the ripples that they're going to make throughout their lives just from being in an environment that is so trusting and fosters that sort of trust in yourself. And I'm curious with the what the eye contact sort of thing, if that's like a thing that's like a Fiddelium specific thing, or if that's like a music specific thing, or what those sort of, is that something that you guys teach? I'm very curious about that situation and process.
We definitely do teach that. So uh, again, I think just arising out of my own continuing self-doubt, years ago, like pre-COVID, so I don't even, like, it's a number, don't ask me. Orange years ago, I'm good with colors. Uh, we realized that when the kids got up, they played this amazing music, but they all stood there and they didn't move and they didn't look at anybody, and it was just sort of static. And the thing is that, you know, in a 2-hour show, that gets tired really fast. So rather than me mentoring that to them, we hired somebody. I paid somebody a lot of money to coach them on how to move. And in the end, it was a complete flop because this person, they'd never met this person before. She did her very best. I mean, she's a pro. She does this, but they had no trust. So here's this stranger asking a bunch of teenagers to move and be groovy on stage. And they're like, you don't even know my name. How can you ask me to do this? So even though, again, my kids don't see me as a performer because I don't perform. I just don't. So I feel like I don't have that street cred with them, you know, but in the end, I had to just step it up and say, okay, look, I'm going to coach you on moving. You have to look at each other for a musical reason. Like if I'm about to play something and I'm coming in at the exact same moment as Ray and I, we can't say, okay, are you ready? We can't do that when we're playing. So we have to make eye contact and we give a physical cue to each other. And that way we totally line up with that first note, right? So it's partly a musical thing, but it's also partly because I found that when we got the kids making eye contact with each other, their entire bodies relaxed. You know, before we focused on eye contact, we were focusing on just getting them to do these kind of moves. And they look like robots on stage until we added that last thing, which is like, look at each other. Because you can't look in somebody's eyes and not, I mean, in that setting, they all know each other. Let's be clear. They've been there together for years, lots of them. They do know each other. And so there's this like feeling of calm, I think, that comes over them when they lock eyes and they're like, yeah, man, I got your back. And then their whole body relaxes. And then they're moving the way that music should make us move, which is just sort of this organic movement. And that's, so that's, I do think it actually starts with eye contact. We got it wrong for many years, but now we've figured that out.
It really is that connection. And I think that because you foster that with your students, that they're taking that and fostering it with each other. Like it really is part of the environment, I find. Like even with my own daughter, I found that it's something that she is prioritizing to a greater degree in her own life outside of Fiddelium. And I don't even know if she recognizes how much those two things kind of came together at the same time. As she got into Fiddelium, she started being more expressive with her friends. She started making more in terms of an effort to connect with them, to empathize with them, to find their music, as it were, to find their groove. And so she's been evolving like that now for months. And a big part of that was, you know, having the courage to try out for Fiddelium. And I loved the fact that you had asked her to do so, and that she went through weeks after that of wondering why, you know, I'm not good enough, why? And it's very much the same thing that you were just expressing yourself. Like every time we were like, well, I don't have a talent there. It's like, what does that mean though? You know, talent for what? Talent for expressing yourself? You just don't have the familiarity with this platform or the familiarity with this, you know, version of expression. That doesn't mean you don't have a talent, because what is talent other than talent for expressing yourself? That's really all it is, right? It's just under different mediums. And so I always find it funny that sometimes people will pick something up and they'll just be good at it, you know, Mozart, so on and so forth. Sometimes it takes time and effort to become familiar enough with the thing to actually let your creativity come through, because it's all doubt. That's really what it is. You're like, I'm not good enough, and so it's not coming through. But once you stop thinking I'm not good enough, once you actually get familiar enough with it where you know what you're doing, well, then all of a sudden you're just faced with the fact that it's just your doubt. It's not
Yep.
the lack of ability, it's just your doubt, in which case now it's just jump in.
Yeah. You know, there's one interesting part of this whole program that I do struggle with, though. So the kids, Andrew, I don't know if you know all the details of how we run the group. So we rehearse together only once a week. And then every week, every single kid in the group has to record themselves playing something. And they send it to me and I listen to it. And I sit here and I type a whole bunch of comments like, you missed the down bow marking in bar 3 on beat 5, and your F sharps are all a little bit too flat. You need to bring them up. And I didn't really hear you get louder in that section that's marked with a crescendo. And I send that back to them. So what am I doing? I'm perpetuating this way that I was trained, right? But the fact is, you know, if I'm teaching my kid how to drive a stick shift, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. Like there's a way that you're going to have a lot more success starting on that hill if you figure out how to use your clutch and your brake and all those things all together. There's a path to success that's easier than another path, right? And my son did learn to drive stick shift, and then he sold it for an automatic because he realized he didn't learn the easy way. I am being really picky about the musical details. I am subscribing to that canon that I was trained in, because there is an easy way and there is a harder way. But in the end, the way that I see that is actually that the kids are coming to this collective expression with a sense of personal responsibility. So it's just like any relationship you have. You have a responsibility to bring what you can of yourself to the relationship, right? You have to do you have to be authentic with yourself and do the work for you before you can be really present in any relationship. We're talking about a musical relationship here. So you have to do the work musically to bring your very best to the group so that collectively we all elevate the experience. We all get to experience that level of excellence. But then back to like, oh, my split brain. Who says it's excellent? What, like, who says? Well, I guess the audiences do. I don't know. And the kids do. They're proud of themselves. So.
Well, I think that's it, though. It's like, what do we mean in terms of excellence? Are we talking about having greater value yourself, or just being closer to playing that in the most effective and impactful way, right? So it's a different kind of excellence. And I think that's what I like about what you're doing. And I'll pass this over to Andrew in a second. It's just the idea that when you went to school, it was very much a group environment where if you were being criticized or if you were, being told, you did this wrong or you did this incorrectly or so on and so forth, everybody was around you, right? And they're all very much young and egotistical and trying to define themselves. And so they're judging you, and you're in this environment where you're just feeling that. And there's a collective stress that goes with that day after day after day after day. And what I like is that you tend to keep your actual group activities rather light. Like it's not like you go easy on them by any means, because you're there to do something, but you're a lot of fun while you do those things. There's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of conversation, but then they go home and they practice on their own. They get your feedback privately. They work on that in their own time. And at no point do you ever go, you should be doing better. You just go, well, this is something you could work on, and that's the point. And that would be really difficult. And it's because you're working with teenagers. You're working with people who are at a point where their amygdala is oversized. And so everything is an enhanced fear response, everything. And so you give criticism and they're like, oh my God, I'm a piece of shit. And you're like, that's not what I meant. It's not what I meant. I just meant maybe work on that note. Right. And so there's that process, which I imagine is quite challenging sometimes, because I imagine these kids do take it personally from time to time, and that you do have to make that contact with them to let them know, like, it's not personal. It's really just that I see the talent in you. I see the potential, and I see that you have the enthusiasm. That must be quite an education in itself.
Yeah, there's no getting away from the fact that if you're a human being living in society, you're going to be in situations where there's a hierarchy, where you're getting feedback from somebody, where you're getting constructive feedback from your employer or your partner or your kids, if you're me. We all have to have strategies for processing that. I mean, sometimes that feedback is hard, even for big people, right? So we really do try. I don't soften the information. Like I'm not going to not tell you that you're playing out of tune, but I really try to always make sure in all my feedback points that there's some positive points in there too, and really recognize the work that they've done on those things. And when I have to come down on the whole group, I come down on the whole group, and then right away I try to let them know that, like, hey man, I love you all. Like you're important to us as people, and I'm not trying to be hurtful. I just need you to step it up because you're lazy teenagers, and so was I at one time. But trying to guide them in a way that gets them to the place that they want to go, but that doesn't feel personal. That is always really hard. They're teenagers, of course, it feels personal. So.
Oh, for sure. And that comes down to what empathy really is, because we have this sort of view of empathy in society that it skews nice. And I don't think that's necessarily the case when everything is factored in. Like sometimes being empathetic is being just brutally honest with someone because you have no control about how they're going to take it. You can have sensitivity though, and understand, as you were saying, as Ray was saying, that these are teenagers and there's certain, functions and their brain is still very much developing, but you don't have control over how they're going to take it. They're going to take it. So all you can do is what you can do. And so it's not really, it doesn't sound like judgment at all. It's just recognition for their sake. And so you can recognize, where you're coming from, and that's the extent of what you can do. And so I think that sort of balance of having the lightness within the groups and then, discussing things with the group, but then, the individual sort of feedback as you go throughout the week sounds like the perfect balance. It reminds me of when I was, I think I've told this story on the podcast before, in seventh grade, sort of it hit really hard, and it made me kind of not remember seventh grade until a mushroom trip a couple months ago. I had a teacher, a Latin teacher. I went to a very, very conservative Catholic middle school, and I got pretty good grades growing up and valued myself a lot based on the grades that I got. And I think I got like a C or a D on a test. And he announced it to the whole class, like 30 kids, 20, 30 kids. And he was like, Andrew got a C, to the point that it was so ridiculous. I think my parents like talked to him because I got home and I was like kind of explaining. I was like 12 years old at the time, and he said it in front of the entire class, and it was just a fascinating experience that I didn't remember until this past year, basically. But it just goes to show. And then in that mushroom trip, I saw sort of ribbons throughout my life where that was like a point that had a lot of impact on me, that then caused me, it was like, to that point, maybe the deepest point of shame or embarrassment that I had felt, but a lot of it was because I, thought grades were really important, and I valued myself based upon that in a lot of ways. But it just goes to show, especially at that age, the impacts. And when someone is coming, like that teacher, no one really liked that teacher very much in any way. So like where he was coming from, and I had other sides of that mushroom trip that I saw different potential sort of realities that may have factored into that situation. But I think that balance between recognition versus judgment is key, because it doesn't sound like there's any judgment coming from you whatsoever, but there is a reality of like, this is playing music, and there's a way to play music. There's not necessarily a right way, but there's things you can realize. And if you're not taking it as judgment necessarily, like when I'm going through stuff in my head and Ray will tell me, hey, stop thinking about yourself so much, there's points in my life where I've been like, how dare you tell me that I'm thinking about myself a lot. Now I'm like, oh, thank you. I really have been thinking about myself a lot, but that's on me. And there's an appreciation for that, because it's not judgmental. It's just recognition.
Yeah. I have a story about university. When I went back to finish my undergrad, I was very proud of the achievement, again, of making it into a studio of a teacher who's kind of, at that time, I would say was probably the top teacher in Canada. And it really was like shocking to me that I got into this school, and that I made it into her studio specifically. She was a very renowned teacher, and I was so excited. So I go off to Ontario to study with this person, and I'm almost 30 years old, going back to school, late 20s. And I'm surrounded by 18-year-olds, right? Because everybody's in first year and I'm in third year in my 30s, right? Or 20s. And there's this thing that happens every week. So you have your private lessons with the teacher. And then there's this thing called a master class that happens. And master class is where you get up in front of all of the other string students in the school. And this was a big, well-known school. So there were lots of string players. And you play your piece and you get a lesson on that piece in front of everybody. So it's like a private lesson, but you've got an audience of like 50 people. You know, so do that again, play that again. No, I want you to fix that. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And during this one masterclass, the teacher listened to this performance, was very lovely, very sensitive, extremely nervous young man. And when he finished playing, the teacher said, "You are a waste of skin." And I just sat there and I thought, I sold a house and moved across the country to study with this person because they were so renowned and so highly regarded in the classical music scene. And that's what you say to somebody to get them to rise to the occasion? Are you fucking kidding me? Like, so the next day I went to the dean. I said, I need to change studios. I'm not studying with this person anymore. And so I did. I got a new violin teacher. And that other teacher came up to me in the hallway one day and she said, "So I hear you switched teachers. I'm so disappointed in you. I thought you had it in you. Thought you had it in you." And I just thought, you are just so fucking off base. Like, what the music is supposed to be the highest expression of music and art, all the arts, the highest expression of our soul, of ourself. We're sharing our soul with people. You're going to tell someone they're a waste of skin and expect them to ever want to share anything with anybody ever again. This poor kid was like maybe 19 and he switched programs. He quit music. He went into engineering school. Who knows? He could have been one of the greatest artists that the world has ever seen, except for that one comment. So our words matter as teachers. We have to be careful.
Well, because they come from a place that has influence. Our mentality has more influence than we think. You know, like you might be really good at playing an instrument, but if you're insecure, you're going to tear down everyone who ever plays with you. Absolutely. Right. And that's really important to remember. And I wanted to actually bring that back because you are actually a teacher. I am not. And yet, despite very clearly saying I am not a teacher, people tend to look at me that way. And so I always try and remind people that to take on that idea that I can teach somebody is almost like a mentality of control. That if I just tell you the right things, you're going to go in that path because I am that good, right? Whereas the actual process of teaching and learning is more of a relationship of learning and teaching on both sides, right? It's something that you're still adapting and changing. And the only way you can do that is in accepting that you don't know everything, you know, especially about the person that you're quote unquote teaching. And so for something like Fiddelium, because again, the CBC Class Challenge and then the awards in 2023, these are all things that require a certain degree of experience and practice and commitment and focus and all of those things. And I imagine it would add a certain note of stress and almost a certain temptation to want to push the kids harder in order for them to meet those commitments. On the other hand, you're also coming at everything from the state of mind where it's like, yeah, but I don't want to destroy these kids' mentality. So how do you strike that balance? And I imagine that it's challenging each and every day, according to each and every child that you work with, showing either enthusiasm or hesitation, and then realizing that it's not just about the music, but it's also about their lives and what they're going through. It sounds just like an incredibly multifaceted challenge.
I think that there's definitely an expectation. So like the CFMA award that they won last year, this is like, unless you're in the folk music scene, people don't know what this award is. The best way I can describe it is a Juno award. It's a national, it's like a big deal, but for folk music. Okay, so this is a big deal that they won this award. And it's really interesting because as soon as we got back and brought the trophy and the kids had a little photo shoot, they all got to hold the trophy and everything, questions started being asked in the community about well, okay, what's the next award you can apply for? What's the next, you know, what's next? And it's like, but it's not about that. It's not about that. So that award was given to them during COVID. Try to imagine how COVID complicated the act of delivering group lessons. Like it was a total shit show. It was awful. And we tried really hard because I do believe that music is a healing thing, and people needed to keep making music with other people. But this platform, Zoom, sucks when it comes to sharing creativity. So we made an album. And because of the rules of COVID, we could only have one person in the room with us at a time. So we multi-tracked. Every individual kid in Fiddelium came in, recorded their part on cans, listening to the person who had recorded before them. Jeff spent, I don't know, 1,000 hours mixing that. It was so much work for him. And that's the album that won the award, which is so funny because if you listen to that album and the one that we made last June, which was live, everybody in the floor together, it was like, you can tell that they're not in the room making eye contact, breathing the same air, vibrating together with the sounds. It's a good album, but it's flat. Right. So we've made this live album. Now we've been nominated for the same award. And yeah, there's a lot of chatter about like, what else can you go for? You know, like, could they get a Juno? Could they get this award? Could they get that award? The kids don't really care about that. What the kids care about is getting up on stage and having that shared vibration. I mean, when you first did your intro, that's the big word that I wrote down on my piece of paper here: vibration. Music is vibration. Humans are vibration. Everything on this planet is vibrating, and music is just the most visceral way for us to experience that vibration together. And I think that that's the thing for the kids. They're chuffed. Hey man, I won an award. That's so cool. Next. That's, so I don't feel the pressure from the kids at all. I feel no pressure that they want me to try to get them another accolade. I feel the pressure from the outside, from the consumers of what they do. And I'm just kind of going, la, 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 I can't hear you. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Perfectly.
Oh. Yeah. And it just goes to show how much the kids are actually there for it, kind of realizing more than, the consumers, the adults, like what the fuck life's all about. Like we can get so addicted because as soon as you mentioned, win an award, it's like, all right, what's the next award? It's like, what are we doing here? Like what's going, are we just trying to win awards? Like, are we just living life for the next thing? Are we practicing for the next thing? Like, when are we actually living? Like, when are things actually going on and actually happening? And, in a world, it makes sense that a lot of people are like, all right, what's next? Where do we go now? Because in the world, like, we're striving for the next thing. Like, my whole life until maybe the last couple of years, I never even knew what it was like to actually be attentive to where I was at. I was always doing things for the next thing. I went to high school to get to a good college, to get to a good job. And you realize at some point, it's like, damn, have I ever actually lived my life for me right now? And so to foster that sort of mentality and to be able to in kids and for them to not be so concerned about that, like the way that that's going to be able to set them up for life. And as I said before, just like the ripples that it makes to have that sort of influence on kids that age is just absolutely incredible. It's very exciting. It gets me very, very excited, having been just someone who went through, maybe not so much with music, but went through the school system to see that there's a shift, there's a change. And I think it goes hand in hand with an overarching shift in mentality of, what life's all about and like what we're really trying to do here.
Yeah. And being in the moment. Like, I think that playing music with other people is the ultimate, like, physical feeling of being in the moment. Like, you can be in the moment. I wish I could be more in the moment all the time. I'm totally working on that. I'm not getting very far right now, but when I'm making music with other people, my body, I feel this moment right now. This is what this feels like to be sharing these sounds and this energy with this other person, right? And that, I think, is really going to help the kids, hopefully going to help the kids remember to look inward, because musically you have to look inward. You have to remember all the work that you've done as an individual to be able to share that in the group and present your contribution to the group or whatever. But I think that experience of them having the visceral experience of that moment with other people, shared moment, maybe that means that for them, when they're going through the good college to get a good job, maybe they'll have good moments with good people along the lines, right? Instead of just being like, okay, what's the next course I got to take? And I got to get an A and I got to get an A, instead of looking up and going, holy cow, I'm surrounded by really fucking cool people.
Absolutely. Well, and I can tell you just from my own experience, one thing I've really enjoyed about the way that you teach and the way that my daughter's been learning from you, because again, you're not her first teacher. She had been learning for quite some time, but always under a different type of environment, a different type of mentality. And it's very much going back to what you were just saying. She's homeschooled. She's got stresses in her life, and she's got, you know, friends and teenage drama and all that stuff. And when she's really lost in her head, she'll reach for her violin, and she finds it very grounding. She'll actually just sink into it. You can tell that she's finding her presence again. And this is something that we focus a lot on the podcast, is in recognizing that there are practices that you can do that will make it easier for you to get out of your head more often. And a big part of it is being involved with something. And that's exactly what you're teaching them, to get thoroughly involved with what they're doing, in the same way that meditators get thoroughly involved with their breath.
Sure.
And so it's great. And I just wanted to share that with you, because it's something as a parent that I love to see. It's something as a human being that I look at my life and I go, God damn it, I wish I had figured that shit out at that age. That's great, right? But it really makes you think about their future and the ripples that they're going to create, not just in university and their jobs and their lives and all that stuff, but everybody they're ever going to meet. I mean, these kids are going out and talking to other teenagers. And those teenagers are like, you know, trying to compete and compare. And while these kids are actually doing something that's fucking amazing, at the end of the day, they're not holding it over anybody's head. They don't walk around going, look at me. You know, I will say though, with the new hoodies, they all look very, very proud of those hoodies. I will say that for sure. I wanted to throw this out just because I know our listener at this point is like, where do I find more of this stuff? You can actually check out Fiddelium on Spotify. You can listen to their music. I would also recommend their YouTube channel. We'll tag all of this in the description, of course, but they have 2 albums, Fiddelium and Lit Up. And Lit Up is the one that's up for the award in 2024, right?
That's the live album. Yeah. And that's the album that I think it's interesting to A/B them. If you're new to listening to this group, if you listen to the first album, first of all, a lot of those same kids are on the second album, and they're 4 years younger. So they're children at that point. So it's maybe extra impressive then that they were, you know, like 12 when they made that album. But for sure, Lit Up, you can hear the connection. You can hear that they're in the same room and they're responding together. And there's YouTube videos actually of that recording session. So you can see them all there with their mics all over the place. And yeah, it's pretty fun. You know, one thing that I think also has like one of my selfish kind of pleasures with Fiddelium. I've always been completely obsessed with music, and definitely not only classical music. I have pretty eclectic music tastes. In high school, I was definitely the goth punk kid who listened to, you know, Deja Voodoo. Maybe there's some listeners who have heard of Deja Voodoo, but if you need to seek them out because they're crazy. And the Vinaigrettes and Carolyn Mark, who's coming to the Vault pretty soon. And, you know, Velvet Underground and David Bowie, early David Bowie, all that stuff. I was really, really into that. And then I went through my undergrad and all the way through studying all the classical music. I had this question, like any time for me that I had stress, same as your daughter, what did I go to? I went to music. I put on my headphones and I cranked something, and it always, within 30 seconds, I feel better, and it never fails. To this day, it is my happy place for sure. And I listen to, you know, again, not just classical music, but I had this question, like, what is it that makes me physically respond? Like, why is it that I can read a book and I still have all those thoughts in my head? I can watch a movie or go see a play, but I still have all my thoughts in my head. But when I listen to music, they go away. It's my kind of meditation. Why? So when I went to grad school, I actually didn't study classical music. I did a degree in popular musicology. Musicology is the study of the social practice of music. How do we use music as a social tool? And there's, you know, all kinds of levels, but popular musicology is the study of popular music, like recorded popular music. And my thesis was on the expression of authenticity in popular music fan communities. So how do musicians manufacture or really truly communicate authenticity to their audience? And it was such an interesting field of study. And I still am really like so fascinated. Why do I have the same response to the Chemical Brothers as I do to Beethoven? Like there's a physical thing that's happening there, and I'm very curious about it. Anyway, for the concerts that are coming up, the kids were invited to form their own little small groups and create their own performance numbers for the concert. And so there's 3 small groups, and this is what they came up with. No guidance from us. One group is doing a Renaissance era motet. Like, where did you even find out about? Like, I don't talk about Renaissance music. What? Okay, well, cool, super cool. They found that. That's great, and it sounds awesome. And then somebody else is doing a Danish piece, a Danish piece for string quartet, and then somebody else is doing Bob Dylan knocking on heaven's door. Like, I won. You know who Bob Dylan is because you're curious about music. My job here is done. I've done my work. I think it's just so cool to have these young kids who have a real passion for music, and they don't just listen to Taylor Swift. They listen. Oh, am I allowed to say that on the podcast? Okay. They listen to everything, like Bob Dylan and, you know, Beatles and Grateful Dead, and like, how cool is that? Very cool.
That is so fucking cool. And that I actually was gonna ask how you balance, you know, if you guys stick to a certain type of music, or if you do kind of explore different types. That was like something I was just thinking about a couple minutes ago, because I don't, admittedly, I don't know necessarily a ton about Fiddelium, and I've listened to a decent amount of the songs you guys have played, and it sounds like there is a decent amount of variation. But was that something for you, like letting them create their own sort of stuff? Like, was that a little bit difficult at first as a teacher who's kind of like overseeing them, to let them sort of explore with it and just be there to help out as you go? Or what's the relationship between you and them as they create and form their own groups? Are you there kind of as like a consultant, or do they come to you and then you help teach them? Very much so.
No, for these projects, they have to create the arrangement on their own. And I'm, you know, being a university victim, I'm pretty sticky about plagiarism. I'm really strict about, like, you can do knocking on heaven's door, but you need to make it your own. You need to find your own voice in this. You can't just listen to the recording and lift it note for note, because that's not what we need to be doing here. I could just go by the record, you know. So the way it works is they have to choose the material. They have to come up with how they're going to present it, you know. So that particular number, one of the kids is playing electric bass, one of the kids is playing trumpet, one of the kids is playing guitar, 3 of them are singing, and one of them has a fiddle line, and they've totally written their own take on it. What they have to do is still send me recordings, and I give them guidance, like, well, you know, maybe this lead line, I can't quite hear that voice enough, so maybe the other people have to be a little quieter here so we can hear the verse and things like that. But they have to do it on their own. The only thing is that I do feel, you know, this current group of kids is just the current group. This is the current moment of Fiddelium. But Fiddelium in 5 years will have a totally different crew of kids in there, and the model and the sort of, I don't want to say brand, but I suppose that's what it is there. Like, it needs to continue. So I can't let them get on stage and just kind of jam band. Can't have any fish on stage. So that we do have, like, we expect to see that they've done the work. And I guess the lesson there is that, for better or for worse, society has commodified, is that the right word? Music, right? And people are paying money to come and see this concert. Now, if you don't want to pay money to come and see the concert, you can come to my studio recital tomorrow and hear some children play Twinkle for free. But if you want to see this very highly polished group, you're going to pay money for a ticket. And for that reason, we have a responsibility as performers to put our best foot forward on stage. So I do expect them to polish it. So they have to, you know, give me a rehearsal schedule and stuff like that, just so that I know that they're taking it seriously and they're being responsible. But yeah, they have total creative freedom. I don't tell them what to play or anything. So
that's amazing. I think a big thing, and this is just speculation based on what I've seen myself, is with Fiddelium Junior, because I know that's a fairly recent addition to Fiddelium, having these two tiers, new students and students who've been there a little bit longer. And the environment that you create, I find that the younger students really do not look up to, but try to emulate the older students. And because the older students are bringing across a mentality of responsibility and communication and authenticity and a certain degree of ease and comfort with themselves, I think the younger students are going to continue to get that mentality. And so as the years go by, you're just going to keep seeing it filter through the generations, as it were. And so that way, the kids that are in Fiddelium Junior right now at some point are going to end up being very much, figure pieces like a lot of the older students are for Fiddelium Senior at the moment, because you have quite a few students in Fiddelium Senior who are amazing. Like, they're just incredible in terms of their presence, their enthusiasm, how involved they get. Like, just they're just forces on the stage. I'm not going to say any names. You know who you are. So it's really just a pleasure to watch, because you can see that it's not necessarily about just mastering the music. It's about self-mastery to a very large degree. And that really is communication with everybody else, because we're all in this together, right? Like, you will learn more about yourself through a relationship than you ever will by yourself in a room, right? And it's because that's where you see your triggers. That's where you get to look at your doubts, and you get to see them in other people, right? You get to see that you're not alone facing all of this crap that's going through your head, and that we can actually come together outside of our heads and make, not to sound cliche, but to make beautiful music.
Now I'm in my 50s now, officially, not just dipping my toe in, I'm fully in my 50s. Looking ahead at the next 60 years of my life, and reflecting back on what has come before. I've had an experience this past year. I lost both my parents, and at the memorial, an old friend from high school that I used to make music with came and expressed her condolences and said, "Hey, you know what? Like, we used to sing together, you and I. I've got this band project that's going on. We need a background singer. Would you be interested?" And so this is somebody that I hadn't been in touch with for quite some time. So things happened, and now I am officially a background singer, and you are not allowed to laugh. No judgment. A Steely Dan cover band.
No judgment here.
I love Steely Dan. It's my guilty pleasure. And they're like an incredible band. And it's so goofy because Ray sort of knows who I am. Like, I'm not standing up because right now I'm in sweatpants. But for this thing, I have to wear like sequins and heels, and I had to learn to put on makeup and all this. It's hilarious. But the point of the story is, I connected with this person who was a friend from high school. We used to sing together all the time. And that friendship is the only friendship from my young life that has survived really deeply. Like, I think about all the people that I met when I was in my 20s at university and at jobs and stuff. We had a great time at that moment. And maybe some of them we kind of kept in touch for a while, but those people have all kind of fallen out of my life. It's somehow. But this one friend who I was creative with between the ages of 13 and 16 is the person who I still really, really count as a very, very close friend. Those years are important years. And these kids get to have those deep spiritual connections with each other, regardless of how old they are. There's 12-year-olds in that group, and there are 18-year-olds in that group, and they're all connected. And I hope that they will stay connected forever. I hope that in the part of the process here is that they're learning how to be really present in relationships, and hopefully have these relationships like forever, for their whole life.
Yeah. And it just goes to show, like, how much of our changes in our life are kind of reflective of where we're at. And you had that sort of connection back then, and I think there's probably a very similar mentality and way of seeing things, and certain things came up throughout your lives, but then to be able to circle back and reconnect like that is incredibly exciting. And I think it's interesting how reflective, the world is of our current mentality and where we're at, and what we're going through, and what we're doing, and how natural it is, something like that. years and years and years and years and years later, there's the connection again through that at a point in your life that, was perfect timing. It makes me wonder how perfect that timing always is, but also, super exciting that you're able to jump into something new, because I don't see a whole lot of people, after the age of even fucking like 25 jumping into new stuff. It's kind of like we jump into a bunch of new things till we're 10, a little bit more new things till we're 20, and then we're kind of just set for the rest of our lives in a lot of ways. And then we just try and maintain for the rest of it. And how much that cuts down on the fucking flavor and spice of life is unbelievable. And I'm just starting in my life to kind of get back into trying new things, because I didn't see it as a point, as I was kind of on the track of like getting somewhere. It's just kind of like, no, you stick to what you're good at. You stick to what you know. And so it's exciting though to be able to jump into new things, and it makes life feel like so much more of an adventure, of an exploration. And it's helpful to not judge yourself along the way, because diving into something new, like you're not going to be an expert necessarily, but there's an excitement in that, and there's a fun to it, and there's an expansion of life. And I see so many people just miss that, or write off every potential new experience after they turn 20 or 30. So is getting back into singing, I'm very curious how that's been for you. Is that something that you've been doing kind of in your spare time, or is this just like totally brand new for you?
No, I've always sung, and when I say I really am a fan of Steely Dan, I'm obsessed. Like I am obsessed. So it wasn't actually hard, because I already knew all the words to every song they've ever recorded. A little bit. I might need some therapy actually. Singing has always been something I do, and it's interesting because I went to school to study violin and viola. And if I walk on stage, when Ray comes to the Port Theatre and watches Fiddelium in concert, you might see me sing. You'll certainly see me talk on a microphone with no hint of fear or hesitation. I play the upright bass. I have not a shred of nerves. But if Ray watches really closely, when I'm holding the fiddle and I'm leading the community group, you will notice that I am struggling. You will see it. If you know to look for it, you'll see that I'm struggling. That's what I was trained to do. That is what I spent my whole professional training doing. And it's the one thing I cannot share on stage. And I think it really is, it's just completely, it was born out of really bad teaching. And then it was nurtured and grown out of, I think, lack of an ability to let go of the ego for me. Like, I think that's the work I have to do. And certainly in listening to your the podcast of yours that I've listened to recently, that seems to be all the ones that I've picked. Every single time I pick one, I'm like, oh shit, stop reminding me. Okay, I'll do the work. It's all about the ego. What I'm curious about for both of you is like, so Andrew, you said that you're not relaxed enough to embark in music practice, and Ray, you said you're not a musician, but did you have experiences, whether it was with music or with art or something as a child, where you had teachers who set you up to doubt your own worthiness of being artistic?
I had a music class in grade 5 that I remember, and they endeavored to teach me the recorder. And in that class, I was very much judged according to whether or not I was playing these pieces correctly. And it was not a very long class. And it was like an hour of each day of my life. And I didn't really give a shit. My teacher didn't really like me. And so after that, I think I went through 3 recorders. They just kept ending up underneath the tire of my grandfather's station wagon. And at that point, I just gave up on music after that.
Oh man. Yeah. I never had anything traumatic that I remember for music, but I know with piano, like I played piano when I was younger, and I actually remembered this yesterday. I was kind of told basically like, oh, piano, learn it because you'll appreciate knowing it when you're older. And it's like I had no desire whatsoever to learn it. Like there was no intrinsic motivation at all. And so that was expressed. Like I would, it was a weekly lesson, and I actually went with a couple of my friends, and it was like elementary school, like third, fourth, fifth grade, I think. And so we would get stamped on our little music book with 20 little boxes. And so we just had to make sure we hit the boxes and then practice. And so every time we would carpool together, and I would show up at my friend's house, and my boxes wouldn't be, there would be nothing filled out. Like I didn't practice at all because I didn't see a reason at all. I was like, why would I? And so I get there and I just like practice it because I also couldn't lie. Like I couldn't just mark it off. And so I would just play it like as many times as I could before we had to leave, just so it gets up there. And remembering it, I was like, holy fucking shit. Like let's spend the whole week just not doing it at all, and then get to that, and I'd get like 5, 6, 7, just whatever there was time for in the couple minutes between when I got dropped off and when we went to the music lesson. And so it was very much just this is something you should do, this is something you should learn, with no desire to learn it whatsoever. And so I was reflected, and I even had, it's funny because I get, performance anxiety in different ways from different points throughout my life. Very much so. Funny you bring up the violin, and that's the thing. I played baseball my whole life, and I got the yips, which is basically when you kind of like forget how to throw a ball, or you try and control it, you try and aim it, you try and control your arm as opposed to just relaxing and throwing it. And so it was from me thinking about it and valuing, where it went. Because there's a moment I had a brutal coach in high school, just like would throw tantrums and tirades, and there was a point, and I can remember it so vividly, where I was playing catch. We were on our spring training sort of trip. I was like 16 or so, and he walked behind the kid I was throwing with. And in that moment, I got this pang of like fear and concern, and I like hesitated as I threw it and kind of like short armed it. And it was like from that point on, I dealt with it. I ended up playing baseball in college. I moved from infield to outfield, so my throws didn't have to be quite as perfect. I could kind of let go a little bit more. But it was like that point, I was playing second base, shortstop at the time, and like that whole practice, I couldn't throw the ball to first base. I was a pitcher at that time, and I still, as I'm talking about it, like I feel the intensity in my arm from the awareness of it is there. And so I dealt with, and I basically white knuckled my way through the rest of my career in a lot of ways. But it was also interesting because that was right around the point where I started to realize that I was probably good enough to play in college. And it started to become about that, because the year before I played infield, had no issues, played super well, was like best kid on my team. And then it was like it went hand in hand with it becoming about the next thing. And so I have no idea where that point started with the music thing at this point, but for music, for me, it was just something that was kind of forced as a should, and there was no enthusiasm or enjoyment behind it. Oh, and so I had a music performance once, a piano performance, and I was kind of like spiteful of having to do it, and so I went up, and I didn't have any concern or fear at that point of like playing in front of crowds, but I went up there completely unprepared. Like I didn't practice fully, and went up there just kind of like, all right, here I go. Totally butchered the song, gave a bow, and just walked off and like sat back down. And it was not a good performance at all. Like I clearly had no idea like the song. Like I practiced, I don't know, maybe like 20, 30 times, but like, kept pausing, redoing things, and just like it's weird to remember that, because that was probably when I was 12 or 13, and how little, it's funny how little concern there was then of like how I did. And at this point now, like if I were to do something and have to perform like that, like there would be so many nerves. But it's the same sort of situation. I wasn't factoring in this sort of like, oh, what are people going to think? What does this mean about me if I do this? I was like, yeah, I don't really like this, but I guess I have to do a performance. So here we are, and this is how it's gonna go.
And it's funny because I think that whole idea of performance, whether it's sports or music or theater, whatever, it doesn't really matter. It all comes back to judgment. It all comes back to our fear of what that other person or people are thinking about us, right? And why for that moment, for that studio recital where you played your piano piece, it really actually should have been okay, totally okay, for you to get up there and play the piece where you were at with that piece at that time, right? Like that should be okay, especially if we're talking about children, right? Like I really I don't know how we can ever get past this in education of the arts. I get that if you're building a bridge to carry millions of people to and from work every day, there's a right way and a wrong way, and we want those people to do it the right way. But why do we get so hung up on the right way to be creative? Like, I just don't see, so I'm glad that you, at that moment, you weren't devastated and it didn't crush your little heart. But for most kids in that setting, they would be crushed. And at some point, I think that happened for me, that I had a bad experience. I wasn't prepared because I didn't do the work, but I couldn't leave that at the door. When I got up on stage and realized I hadn't done the work, immediately it wasn't about, well, hey, I own this because I didn't do the work. It was about, all those people are going to not like me because I'm going to make a mistake in bar 5, which is just so stupid, I think. And the other thing you said that I think is interesting is that you can feel it when you talk. You can feel the body memory. Trauma stays in our body for sure. And so the way that stage fright manifests for me, and now my secret will be out, so now Ray will totally know what to look for. So when you use your bow, your right arm is extending all the way out to a full extension and coming back to like almost touching your collarbone. When I have stage fright, I can only do this. I cannot extend my arm. So if Ray sees me on stage and I'm playing everything with like 1/4 of an inch of bow and my elbow is all bent, it's because my arm will physically not move. I'm not shaking. I don't feel nervous. I'm not up in my own head. My arm physically will not move. End of story. It won't move. And it's obviously not my arm that's the problem, but it's just interesting that trauma that we cause ourselves because we are thinking we're not good enough is stored in our body in various ways, right? It's tragic.
Well, and it's funny because, and this is the reason I homeschool, a big part of that is the way our kids are educated. The fact that everything that they do is graded and measured according to a spectrum of 0 to 100%. So they actually start to quantify everything that they do. And that's great, as you said, for building a bridge, learning math, science, you want to be a doctor, great. But when it comes to being yourself, there is no right way. Oh. There is no way to measure you. There is no way to measure your value, your potential, or your progress. It's not something that can be quantified. And we're not told that in school. Like when we're graded, we actually think that we're graded, not the work. Right? And that makes a big difference to how we think about ourselves. And so this is why I always say to people, like, just jump in. Just keep jumping in the same way that you tell your students, you got to start playing at some point. Like, just look at each other and just start. And what's interesting is that we get so very caught up on what we think is the problem that we don't recognize that we are a whole and complete being. And what I mean is, and I'll use you as an example. You're experiencing stage fright in this very one specific part of your life, and it's because of the history in that. And so you're looking at that as the problem, but that's connected to a bunch of other things that have also been influenced by that stage fright over the years. And so you jumping into the Steely Band cover album, or the cover band, for example, is you tackling that stage fright from an entirely different angle. Sure. Right? Every time you jump into something, you are tackling that inner narrative that says that you can't, from a different angle. It doesn't have to be the tree that you're staring at. You can walk around the tree and go from a different angle, right? It's just that we don't realize that. We think, unless I'm tackling that fear specifically, I'm not tackling fear as a whole. And it's so very interesting that we make progress, whether we see it or not. But as soon as we try to measure that progress, it's like we stop in order to do so. We just stand there. It's like, am I making progress? Or not now. You were doing just fine up until then. Just keep going. And yet we stop and we tell ourselves a story. Like, I will tell myself that I'm not good with music. I don't know that. I've never spent enough time playing music to really know, right? Or you'll tell yourself that, I deal with this stage fright. Yeah, or it could be a bunch of other fears. that are just being triggered by that situation that seems familiar, right? Like one way or another, you're always working through it. And so I wanted to point out, before we wrap all this up in the next little while here, you and your husband have taught 500 or more students on the island over the last 20 years or so. That's a lot. And at some point, you would have just started as a teacher. And as a beginning teacher, you would have had insecurities and doubts and fears. You wouldn't have known what to do or how to do it. You would have been working to connect with your students and with yourself and all of that. And yet here you are, 500 plus students later, and you probably don't think about most of that anymore.
Well, I think that from the very beginning of teaching, I always thought about it, and I do continue to think about it every day that I walk down here into my studio. I have some little things that other people might not recognize, but are like little talismans that just remind me that I don't want to be those teachers that I had. I want a daily reminder that I don't want to be that teacher. I don't want to crush anybody's creativity. I don't want anybody to be wrapped up in self-worth when we're talking about is F sharp. We're not talking about your value as a human or whether you're worthy. We're talking about that F sharp. Just fix the F sharp. That's all I'm asking, So I think that because I am a teacher by choice. I think there are a lot of music teachers who teach because society is so fucked up about how we pay creative people that I have very few colleagues who make their living at music who own a house or a car because they can't afford to, because we don't pay our creative people. So a lot of those people who are performers, they can't put food on the table if they don't teach. They don't really want to teach. They're not really interested in teaching. They have no interest in the relationships that you have to nurture, and so they're not really effective teachers. Those relationships really matter to me. Like it fills me up just as much as I hope it fills my students up. And I've always really made a very mindful effort to never be that teacher who shuts somebody off. And if I feel like that's starting to happen with a student, I'm going to say to them or their parent, we're not always a good fit. Humans don't always mesh. And so I think maybe you should interview some other teachers, because maybe I'm not the right teacher for your child, and that's okay. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with me or something wrong with your child. It's just I'm not best friends with everybody I meet, and so I still have insecurities, right? I still have total imposter syndrome. I really do. Like as a teacher, my students get to a certain level, and I used to pass them off to another teacher because I didn't think I was good enough to teach those advanced kids. And now I don't really care about that so much anymore as I care about those relationships. I love these kids. Like I'm really lucky to get to meet these kids when they're 3 years old, lots of them, and they're with me till they graduate from high school. That's a pretty magical relationship, and it's pretty neat to get to sort of be part of their life. So I still have insecurities. I don't know. That was a shit.
Without a doubt, absolutely. We go through the same thing all the time, but nonetheless, over all of those years and all of those classes and all of those relationships, you've become more aware of what your own priorities are. You've become more aware of what you don't want to invest in terms of strategies and ways of thinking about your students or ways of thinking about what you're doing. You've learned a lot, and you continue to get better and better and better at it. What's interesting, and I always find this kind of funny, have you ever heard of epiphenomenalism?
I've heard you use the word. You have to tell me what it is.
Basically, it's the theory that your body is already doing something, and that your mind takes ownership of it after the fact. So you are already playing music, as it were. It's not until you start thinking about it that the transmission gets all distorted, right? And so it's really just about trusting yourself all the time, getting into the flow, as it were. But we can do that all the time, right? It's just that we're so used to going, how am I doing?
Sure, turning things into a performative act instead of just experiencing that moment.
Exactly. So while you are teaching your students, as much as you might be saying like, well, I don't know if I'm good enough, or I don't know if I'm saying the right thing, or experiencing imposter syndrome, you're still doing the action that you're supposed to be doing. You're still saying the things that you're supposed to be doing. It's just the narrative in your head that's actually almost making it harder to appreciate how good you are at it. And it's just because you care that much. You actually do care, but you care because you're caring about yourself as well. Like you think about yourself as a student when you're thinking about yourself as a teacher. And so that makes it far more authentic, because then you're teaching it from a point of view of not being a hierarchy, but empathy.
Sure. I hope
it comes across that way.
And I will say, I think the insecurities to a degree are healthy as well, like in a lot of ways, and allow for a maintenance of sensitivity. Like if say hypothetically you taught now and had experienced no insecurity whatsoever, no self-doubt whatsoever. It's like all this, everything you wished you felt great all the time, you felt comfortable all the time, jump into things super easily. Like it would be tougher to connect, especially with teenagers, like the amount of just like shit that's going on. And so there's almost been, at least in my perspective and in throughout my life, like I always thought that it would be best for me to become the perfect version of myself. And what does that even mean? I have no idea. But it's this thing that's over there. It's like, it's not here. Who's to say that this isn't it? Who's to say that I'm not the perfect version right now with all the fear, all the doubt, all the insecurity, and the vitality of having some of that in order to even know what it's like, to remember what it's like. You know, I experience all sorts of nerves and insecurity right now. I get nerves before every podcast episode that we do. But if I never felt that, then I wouldn't be able to relate as much. It's like it becomes a sort of forgotten experience. And then when you interact with someone who's maybe going through something similar, it's like, oh, you know, yeah, you'll figure it out, whatever. There's very little connection there. And so I think at least throughout my life, I've gained more and more of an appreciation for those little self-doubts, insecurities, nerves and whatnot, because it really does help with my connection to everything. It's like it's my tunnel, it's my bridge to connection to, you know, in so many relationships, because it's right there. It's like, oh yeah, no, I know that feeling. Here's some thoughts on that. But if it hadn't been felt for years, you know, it would be far more difficult to connect with people in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think you're right that it keeps your ego in check. It can keep you honest, right? And something you said earlier, I'm also a cured Catholic, and so we have some generational Catholic trauma that we may have to work through, but we can spell ciborium, so we're okay.
Yeah, we all suffer through that Catholic trauma for sure. We were thinking about creating a support group for people who struggle with religion and education. You know, just hey, you went to school, come on in. You've been in religion, come on in. You've got some shit to work through. You know, we are going to wrap up here shortly, Trish. But I really wanted to say that what I find so very interesting about this, the thing that you're teaching your students, the thing that you're learning yourself, the thing that I'm always trying to learn, is that it's the act of listening that really allows us to connect with one another. When we're listening through the filter of our identity, through how it reflects on us, what it means about us, then everything we hear is going to be a reflection of that inner narrative. But as soon as we get out of that narrative, in the same way that we can hear the music, we can hear each other. And it's just that we don't necessarily have a concept of where things are going or what it means about us or what the end result will be, because that's all in the realm of thought and control. But if you're playing music for the point of getting to the end, then you're not listening to each and every note. You're not playing the actual song. And that's very much what life is about, is playing the song and just listening. And so before we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us here today. It has been an absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to seeing Fiddelium this weekend.
Thanks so much for having me. It was nice to meet you, Andrew.
Great to meet you too, Trish. It's been a blast. And it's very helpful for me right now as I'm realizing that I did not have my microphone as my microphone this entire episode. And I am not in a room that is well carpeted necessarily. So I hope this sounds all right, but it is what it is, you know, and you learn and you keep moving forward and you take things in and you don't judge yourself for it, and allows you to, you know, continue to take things in. So I really appreciate you. I really, really, again, as someone who's been through many systems throughout their life, to see someone like you with your mentality interacting with teenagers and kids means, like, I get emotional if I talk about it or think about it too much, because I appreciate it a lot. The ripples you're making will go far beyond anything, any of us could realize, as we're always doing. But yeah, thank you for everything that you're doing, and for joining us today.
Thank you.
And to our listener, do keep in mind that there is actually a Fiddelium album that is for sale. Not only can you listen to some of their stuff on Spotify, but you can listen to their latest album. We will provide a link in the description underneath this. Andrew does come out to the island occasionally, so I will be bringing him to a Fiddelium performance. And at some point, I would love to talk to you about having Fiddelium come and perform it, possibly at our Port Alberni retreat, because that would be a hell of a treat for our guests. And I know everybody listening to this episode would love to hear that in person. Trish, thanks so much. To our listener, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. I am going to send you actually a link to our community topics episode on music, because I think that you'll genuinely enjoy it, because we talked about how music is used to influence us throughout our life, including by certain countries teaching us their national anthem, and by certain religions teaching us their psalms and all of that fun stuff. So I'll send that to you as well. But Trish, thank you so much. We're going to sign off here, everyone. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
And now that you've heard from Trish, please put your ears together for this incredible performance by Fiddelium, and stay tuned till the end for a QR code to their latest album.